Hey everyone, just before the video starts, I want to let you know that this is a part 2 of a 2-part theory video, so if you haven't watched the first one, be sure to check that one out too. It's not strictly necessary to understand what I'll be talking about here, but it would be greatly appreciated and would provide a fuller understanding of the theory as a whole. To briefly recap though, there's dialogue in both stories featured in Sonic X Shadow Generations that suggest how it is that Whitespace operates, and based off of that, I believe that every single level we find in Whitespace is a pivotal moment in time that Eggman chose that almost guaranteed his victory over Sonic, and so both of the Sonics, classic and modern, must re-experience those moments in order for the timeline to be restored. When we last left off, I'd mentioned that while Shadow Generations was marketed as a celebration of Shadow's history, I still believe that his Whitespace is catered to Sonic 2. And I'd like to preface this with the fact that Black Doom and his Black Moon exist within Whitespace completely separately from Eggman's plan. He says that this temporal anomaly is helping him reform faster than intended, meaning that he is likely unaware of the Time Eater's existence, and as far as we know, bringing Shadow here was not part of Eggman's plan, nor did he know that Black Doom still lived on. In fact, the only reason Black Doom may be able to exist in Whitespace to begin with is because of his link to Shadow, causing a sort of unintended chain reaction. Shadow's here because he has a Chaos Emerald, and Black Doom is here because Shadow's here. Yet despite this, no locations from the Black Arms incident are here, and though one could call into question whether any given one of them really happened or not, we know for sure that at least 2 locations from Shadow the Hedgehog must have happened. Westopolis and The Last Way, the former being the first level no matter what path you end up taking, and the latter being the only level in the canonical last story segment. Shadow's adventure begins on the Space Colony arc, which features motifs that reflect how it was presented in some of the levels in his own game, but much like Green Hill's Act 1, the arc's first act happens before the Time Eater sends everyone to Whitespace. Despite the level being called Space Colony Arc, that's the name of the actual location, not the name of any level in this series. The closest thing we have is a level from Shadow the Hedgehog simply named The Arc, the only level in the game without a hero mission. But the only thing I can think of that the stage borrows from The Arc is the turrets that act as a defense system. Something to note is that Shadow's The Arc and Generations' Space Colony Arc both remix Final Rush's theme Highway in the Sky as opposed to Final Chase's theme The Supernatural, almost as if to indicate that Sonic's stage is the more important, truer version of the stage, especially when juxtaposed with the theme from their fight in this area known as For True Story. Speaking of which, there's another level in Shadow the Hedgehog that Space Colony Arc Act 1 does remind me a bit more of though, and it's a level called Space Gadget, a level that, ironically enough, has a very similar dark mission to the aforementioned level The Arc, and, much like Sonic and Shadow's encounter in Generations, is also a level where you're racing Sonic for the sake of a Chaos Emerald only for Shadow to end up with it regardless of if you beat him or not. And the reason it reminds me of this level is because of the sections with the green floors where gravity shifts. Overall, Act 1 seems to remix elements from Final Rush, The Arc, Space Gadget, and the inside sections from Tails' Eternal Engine. But again, since this is before we end up in Whitespace, this kind of makes sense. This area hasn't been affected by the Time Eater and Eggman's plan. Act 2, which is accessed through Whitespace, does feature elements from Final Chase, however, as well as what would appear to be inside locations from Lost Colony, since certain areas seem to be deactivated. Which would make sense, as Lost Colony was the first time Eggman had visited the Arc. And it's strange, right? If I believe that Whitespace is meant to reflect Sonic and Eggman's past specifically, why are there gravity cylinders and so many meteors like in Final Chase? Well, there's something to note about how Shadow Generations differs from Sonic Generations. As I mentioned before, classic Sonic ventures through Act 1s, while Modern tackles Act 2s, and Shadow has to do both. But there is something they share in common. Each act is constrained to a certain dimensional plane. Classic acts are in 2D, while modern acts are mostly in 3D. For Shadow, the opposite is true. His first acts are in 3D, while his second ones are constrained to 2D. But it was during the writing of this script that I came to kind of a crazy realization. In this game, Shadow's first acts are largely based on Sonic's version of these stages, while his second acts are based on either Shadow's version of events or are entirely new. Rail Canyon is a fantastic example of this. If you compare the intro of Shadow's Act 1 to the intro of Team Sonic's version of the stage in Heroes, they line up almost exactly. Team Dark's version, however, features additional rails with rhino liners on them, where you're grinding for much longer than on Team Sonic's version of the stage, which the version in Gen seems to emulate. As well, Act 2's elements feel more similar to Team Dark's version of Bullet Station than Team Sonic's. They're not too different from each other in Heroes, but the way some of the rails are set up look more inspired by Team Dark's stage, almost as if to indicate to us that the 2D perspective, the classic perspective if you will, is more similar to how the events truly happen to the person experiencing it, while Act 1 is how Sonic experienced it. What brought this to my attention, and to an extent what inspired me to talk about this whole concept, was Kingdom Valley. It was kind of bugging me why Shadow visits the super speed section at the end of his Act 1 when Sonic is the only character who visits this area in 06. And then, while writing this script, I wanted to compare Shadow's version of the stage to his Act 2 to see if what I had just noticed held up. I gotta be honest, Kingdom Valley's layout isn't one I remember all too well, so I couldn't remember how similar Sonic, Shadow, and Silver's version of the stage were. I can kind of see how Kingdom Valley Act 2 is similar to Shadow's version in 06, because most of it happens indoors, I guess, but then I decided to compare it to Sonic's version, and I was amazed at just how much of Sonic's Kingdom Valley was used in Act 1, beyond just the super speed section. There's a part at the beginning of Sonic's version that's copied almost exactly later on in Shadow's Act 1. Sonic runs on the wall in his version of the stage, and there's an alternate path Shadow can take where he does just this. Do you want to know how many airstreams Shadow grinds on in his version of the stage in 06? 1, at the very end of it. Meanwhile, Sonic has multiple different airstreams he uses throughout his version of the stage. And you want to know what else I noticed? Shadow starts his Act 1 coming in holding onto an eagle, and you might think that it's referencing the fact that he starts off his version of the stage with an air glider, and that very well might be. But here's the thing. The reason he does so is because he accesses Kingdom Valley by way of a portal inside of a nearby cave. Meanwhile, Sonic and Silver get here through the use of an eagle, meaning that Shadow's the only character who doesn't do so. The only major reference to Shadow's version of the stage are the water sections where he originally used a hover vehicle, now using Doomsurf. And really think about why this level is here in the context of Sonic and Shadow's versions of the stage. As the second stage in Shadow's story, his version of Kingdom Valley happens pretty early on, meant to serve as an extraction point for him, Rouge, and the Scepter of Darkness they just stole from Eggman. But right after this stage is when Mephiles is unleashed, setting into motion the rest of the events of the story. For Sonic, meanwhile, right after his Kingdom Valley is when the egg carrier crashes, leading to the deaths of both Princess Elise and Dr. Eggman. Presumably. We know Elise dies, and I'm guessing Eggman does as well, assuming he didn't make a last-minute escape. And the reason Sonic's version is significant is because it's where he and Silver team up to use a dual chaos control and send Sonic back in time in order to save them. Sonic's version is important to Eggman's survival, while Shadow's version is significant to the overall timeline. Solaris can never be blown out if Mephiles is never released, and he likely wouldn't have been if Eggman hadn't ambushed Shadow and Rouge at the end of their Kingdom Valley. At this point, though, I'm starting to notice a trend with Shadow's white space, which I'll touch upon later. Sunset Heights was the one that almost convinced me to make this video, because what's so interesting about it is that it's the only level that is canonically named after a Sonic stage. Space Colony Arc was the best choice for a name because calling your very first stage Final Rush or Final Chase doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not to mention, those names reflect what each respective character is going through at the time they happen. Sonic is rushing through the stage, but as the last level for the hero side story, it's the Final Rush. The dark characters have been doing their fair share of chasing, but as the last level, it's the Final Chase. In Sonic Forces, there are various areas that each have multiple levels that take place in them. This area is known simply as City, but each character has their own name for their version of the stage. The Avatar's level is called Park Avenue, Classic Sonic's is called Ghost Town, the tag team one is called Redgate Bridge, and Shadow's stage is called Enemy Territory. But only modern Sonic's version of the stage is known as Sunset Heights, and what's curious about Shadow's Act 1 of the stage is that it doesn't just use elements from modern Sonic's Sunset Heights, but where the original stage would have ended, they added an entirely original second half of the stage, largely inspired visually by the bottom route of classic Sonic's Ghost Town. The funny thing is, Shadow's stage, Enemy Territory, is already based off of Sunset Heights, with a little bit of Park Avenue in between. And the differences between each stage aren't constrained to just the level name, because each level has its own music as well. Enemy Territory stands out because it remixes the Westopolis theme from Shadow the Hedgehog with a little bit of Radical Highway from Adventure 2. In fact, all 3 episode Shadow levels feature remixes as opposed to original themes. And yet, the music they decided to use was again the theme from Sunset Heights. And Act 2 is a bit strange because it's a dark, rainy version of the level which we've never seen before, and while parts of it resemble the latter half of the original Sunset Heights, this one does borrow a lot of elements from Enemy Territory, again from the latter half of the stage, which was more original to Shadow, alongside some of its enemies such as the Galaga Bees. Almost as if they were rewriting the future, and this was always what Enemy Territory was supposed to look like. Except for the fact that because the level is supposed to take place a month before the events of Sonic Forces, there are no Death Egg robots in Enemy Territory, whereas they exist in literally every other version of the stage, both acts and generations included. As for why it's relevant enough to be here, I'm not sure. Nothing really happens during or immediately after Sunset Heights for Sonic. The only thing I can think of is that taking episode Shadow into account, it's the very first level of the game, setting off the rest of the events into motion. It's the place where classic Sonic meets up with Tails, the Avatar saves a bunch of civilians, or so we're told. It's where we fight the phantom copy of Metal Sonic, but perhaps most importantly, it's the place where Sonic gets defeated by Infinite. The only thing is, that doesn't happen around the time Sonic's version of the stage takes place. Sunset Heights isn't played until much later, and its only purpose is for Sonic to find Shadow. Once they meet up, Shadow informs Sonic that Infinite can create phantom copies, but that's about it. I mean, given that Tails and Classic Sonic were about to find out this information anyway, it doesn't really amount to much of anything for either Sonic or Eggman. The only thing I can think of that would be the reason for this level's inclusion is that it's the place that best represents Eggman's takeover of the world, and is where Sonic and his friends, known as the Resistance in this game, have their base of operations. Chaos Island was the weirdest one because it's the only stage in which, at the time of the game's release, Shadow wasn't present in any version of it. However, I think that the game this is from is the key to understanding the entirety of Whitespace in its current iteration. Since there's nothing but the main island to compare it to, I want to shift focus to what we can observe happening during this level in Generations. From the offset, one of the first things we can see is the decommissioned Death Egg robot from the events of Forces, meaning we know this has to be a Chaos Island set after those events. As well, you can see plenty of Eggman technology and structures, which he would have installed across the Starfall Islands just before the events of Frontiers. But what firmly cements when this level is taking place is what happens during a certain rail grinding section where we can see the volcano erupting. This tells us that the level is not only taking place during the events of Frontiers, but right before Sonic would have fought the Night Titan. If previous Act 2s are possibly taken from Shadow's versions of these stages though, what does Chaos Island's second act borrow from if Shadow was never there? Well, here's the thing, you know how Sunset Heights' second act had sections that didn't look like anything we'd seen before either? I think something we're forgetting is that these stages also take Eggman's version of events into account. We have some clues as to why Shadow's Act 2 is the way it is, but it requires us to pay attention to what's happening in the background. At the end of Act 1, we can see some of Eggman's boxes which contain things he brought to explore the Starfall Islands, and Act 2 starts off near some Eggman-built structures. And looking at the background here, we can see the sulfur deposits that Sonic can visit in Frontiers, but Shadow can't in this game. It's almost as if the 2D plane we're on is surrounding the main island, going around and into a temple, not before passing by another Eggman structure. This is where things start to seem unfamiliar. We can see we're in a temple, but it has elements to it that we don't recognize. We start to see lifts and beams that had to have been built by Eggman though, like the ones we see on other parts of the Starfall Islands and Frontiers, particularly in structures that belong to the Ancients. And the area that most confused me was the room where you can see the symbol of their god in the background with the floor covered in lava. This doesn't resemble any area we visit in Frontiers, except that it does. This is that area that is unlocked after Sonic and Tails activate the broken down Death Egg robot on the island, which opens up a path into the underground temple, and you can see its undisturbed form as Sonic. But if the volcano was set off by Sonic in Act 1, is this where the lava eventually ended up? And are we only able to see it because Eggman built an alternate entrance to this place? In Frontiers, we hardly see any Eggman tech in here aside from a single green pod, but none of these structures are in the background. And we know that this is the right location because Shadow's Act 2 ends with the exact same upwards ramp spiraling the exact same tower where we exit as Sonic in Frontiers. Is this hinting at a possible future where Eggman returns here to learn more and so we're venturing through his memory? But that kinda goes against the theme we've had so far. Act 2s have always had some sort of Shadow influence in them, so why would Chaos Island be the exception? Well, here's the part where I'm losing my mind, because in Frontiers, Sonic has these random instances where he'll stop and mention something from his past, whether it be a location or a character. These instances are so rare that I can't really find anybody replicating them, but I had an experience where Sonic mentions that at this point he wouldn't mind Shadow lending a hand, and the place where this line played for me just so happens to be the exact same area where the Goal Ring is found at the end of Shadow's Act 2. I will admit, the place I found it was probably just a huge coincidence, because the only other video evidence I've managed to find of someone coming across this line had it playing close to the volcano, but given that it also played during Chaos Island, we can assume that this dialogue is likely exclusive to this location. Now, bear in mind, Sonic isn't just saying this, he's saying it at a point in time when the cyber corruption he's suffering from is reaching its peak, making it difficult for him to continue. And the reason I find this significant is because of the things we learn about cyberspace and frontiers. For one, we learn that the random assets we interact with across the Starfall Islands aren't actually there. They appear to Sonic, Amy, Knuckles, and Tails as a result of their link with cyberspace. Sonic being able to escape from it and absorb cyber corruption through giving his friends their respective memory tokens, and the rest of the team being trapped inside it. Their link to cyberspace begins to create physical manifestations in the real world that more easily allow them to traverse the islands, the same way that Sonic's memory shapes cyberspace as a whole. This being the case, how then is Shadow able to interact with these objects during his visit in Generations? He's never visited cyberspace at all. Well, in one of the egg memos, we learn that cyberspace gathers environmental data from various points across the world and uses that data to take on its appearance. But we learn from Sage that what gives each location its form is the visitor's memory, which is why so many of them resemble places from Sonic's past. There are a few that are entirely original, but there are two specifically that are not taken from Sonic's memory, 2-4 and 2-6, which take the form of Radical Highway and Skyrail respectively. So why am I telling you all this? Well, you're not gonna believe me, but I think the answer lies with everybody's favorite large feline, Big the cat. Now, earlier I mentioned that Big's reason for being in Whitespace was likely because of Froggy and his connection to Eggman's schemes. But Big also makes a surprise appearance in the fishing minigames from Frontiers, which just so happen to also take place in cyberspace, not the Starfall Islands themselves. But there's a very important distinction at play. Big can only be found through what are known as purple portals. The game never really makes it clear what the distinction between those and the regular ones is, but as I understand it, where the regular portals are meant to record the user's memory, the purple portals are the ones that are actually meant to be visited and returned from. There are no portal gates to be found, meaning that this is an area where Sonic can come and go as he pleases. And as we find out in the Another Story DLC, the Big that we encounter here isn't real. He too is a recreation based off of Sonic's memories, and the reason he's able to interact with us and seem so authentic is because of how strong Sonic's memory of him is. And that kind of makes sense, given that the rest of the place just looks like regular Kronos Island otherwise. Maybe the purple portals don't show you locations, and instead they show you people from your memory specifically. But it's worth noting, Sonic didn't need to be actively thinking about him for him to appear. And that kind of makes sense, right? Though he and Sonic don't interact often, they do run into each other a lot throughout their journeys, even ones where their adventures aren't related at all. In fact, Big is the only character to have been to Soliana and remember it, likely because his visit there had nothing to do with the events of 06, so what a coincidence that the character that Sonic meets in Frontiers because of a subconscious memory is found at a location that no one else has a conscious memory of. Having said that, it stands to reason that cyberspace can pull from your subconscious memories and give them form, even if you haven't thought about them for a while. So what does all of this have to do with Shadow being on Chaos Island and allowing him to interact with the world in the way that he does? Well, if cyberspace can create things based off of subconscious memories, how well can it link to actively conscious ones? Shadow can visit and interact with Chaos Island not because he was here, but because someone with a strong link to cyberspace was thinking about him while they were here. And if you need any more circumstantial evidence that this might be the case, consider the fact that Sonic and Shadow's paths cross right after Shadow fully restores Chaos Island. Think about how we access cyberspace on the Starfall Islands, through portals with a circular opening that bear a reddish-pink light within it. And what's contained within these portals? Challenges that test the user's abilities, set in places based on the user's memories, sometimes with slight variations, whether that be in the layout or the time of day. Completing these challenges to the best of the user's abilities changes the portals, making them shimmer or change color. And what do we receive for completing the challenges contained within these portals? Keys that allow us to access something that returns the power of the Chaos Emeralds to us. And what is the one crucial connection between Cyber and Whitespace beyond resembling areas from their past? In Whitespace, Tails says that Sonic's speed is what is restoring space-time, and while not directly stated, the end tells Sonic that he was able to escape cyberspace through his own power. What's Sonic's power if not his speed? And the thing is too, Sonic isn't just restoring the locations in Whitespace, but returning life to his friends who have their bodies stuck here while their lives are tied to the locations they're frozen at. In fact, when the cyber corruption takes hold of Sonic on Raya Island, he freezes in place much like his friends do in Whitespace. Something else that the two share in common is that rather than return to the entrance of the stage in order to exit, the Sonics and Shadow must reach their respective goals in order to return to Whitespace, whereas Sonic needs to find portal gates to return from cyberspace. It isn't simply that they go to the next stage like they've done previously, but they return to the world they entered from. And the portal that opens when the gang first arrives on the Starfall Islands is suspiciously familiar, don't you think? Now, I'm not necessarily saying that they intended for white space to be a form of cyberspace. I'm fully aware that these are likely just coincidences in the real world, and there are plenty of differences between the two as well. But taking into account how cyberspace is set up, some of the anomalies we've talked about start to make a bit more sense. I mentioned that there are 2 cyberspace stages that resemble levels that Shadow visited, not Sonic. And it would make a lot of sense if these stages were found in Chaos Island, but as it so happens, they're found on the previous one, Ares Island. And this could very well be a matter of the past influencing the future in a way unbeknownst to us. In Sonic Generations, there are challenge gates that feature our friends in locations they've never been to, at least not that we've seen. Amy and Chemical Plant in Sky Sanctuary, Espio and Speed Highway, Cream and City Escape, and Vector in Crisis City and in Rooftop Run alongside Charmy. Even in Shadow Generations, we see that Rouge enters the portal leading to Sonic and Shadow's encounter, meaning that characters can certainly visit locations in white space they've never been to before, so long as a version of Sonic is there as well. And the reason that's relevant is because it's possible that Shadow visiting Chaos Island in Generations could have altered cyberspace's data in Frontiers, presenting Sonic with locations he's never been to before. Locations which might subconsciously put Shadow in Sonic's mind, making him think of Shadow in the subsequent island. And I believe that this also has an influence on the boss's Shadow encounters. To start, something that's curious about the boss gates in Shadow's version of white space is that they aren't simply out in the open the way they are for Sonic. Shadows are typically contained within castles made up of bricks like the one we see at the lair of the Time Meter. Unlike the Time Meter's portal though, these castles don't seem to be broken or formless. They're carefully constructed, untouched, with the boss gates seemingly inaccessible. And oh my god, I think I just came to a realization while typing this out. These boss gates are only accessible because of Shadow's Doom powers. Without them, Shadow would literally be unable to reach them. As well, where in Sonic Generations you only need to clear one of the 10 challenge gates to obtain a boss key, in Shadow Generations every single challenge act needs to be completed. And why is so much of Shadow's white space covered in water where there is none in Sonic's area? In fact, we see at the end of Shadow's campaign that he and Rouge head to Sonic's area of white space through a bridge found past where you would obtain Doomsurf, and the first thing you would come across if you came in through Sonic's area is a large body of water. And remember the cyber corruption I mentioned earlier, which when absorbed enough freezes Sonic in place? Well, in Shadow Generations, they reintroduced the purple liquid that Mephiles used in 06, which Shadow can only navigate in this game through the use of his Doom Morph, giving it the name Corruption, which is primarily found around Chaos Island's stage entrance and is the only level to feature it. Why would there be so many obstacles and ways to prevent you from reaching the boss gates unless you really didn't want someone to access them? And mind you, these stage entrances are always there. We see after beating the Bio-Lizard that the rest of Shadow's white space takes form, but we can also see that Kingdom Valley, Sunset Heights, and Chaos Island, the rest of the locations we haven't visited, are already there. But before they're unlocked, they're all surrounded by water. Are the bosses and locations from Shadow Gens things that Eggman specifically did not want Sonic to restore? I mean, think about it. Space Colony Arc led to Eggman activating the Eclipse Cannon with all 7 Chaos Emeralds, which activated the Arc's collision course to Earth, something he helped everyone else stop. Rail Canyon is where NYA'LL successfully copied everyone's lifeform data, leading to his transformation at the end of the game, which he again teams up with the heroes for. Kingdom Valley is where both Mephiles gets released from the Scepter of Darkness, as well as where Elise dies, releasing Iblis and destroying the world. Sunset Heights is where Classic Sonic, the character who defeated his Egg-Dragoon Mark II and was instrumental in helping the Resistance take back the world, showed up. And I just remembered, it's also the place that the Avatar is from, and they're also the only other character that was vital to Eggman and Infinite's defeat. Chaos Islands was a bit more difficult to figure out, since at large, there's nothing here that doesn't happen on the previous 2 islands. But then I remembered part of the reason I even came to this realization in the first place. Chaos Island is the point in the story where Sage accepts that the only way she'll be able to save Eggman and get him out of cyberspace safely is if he agrees to form an alliance with Sonic, something he explicitly states he doesn't want to do. And then, Sage mentions the other times he's done exactly this.
But together you stopped the Arc, overcame Neo-Metal.
And a point of data they wouldn't have is the other alliance they formed, where together they stopped Solaris. These points in time that Eggman wants to restrict are every time he had to ally himself with his arch-nemesis, or to prevent his most crushing defeat. And I think it also explains why there's no level from Lost World here. That game's story almost flips this ongoing trope on its head entirely. During most of these examples, Eggman acts as an antagonist for most of the game, only to team up with the heroes at the end to overcome a bigger threat. In Lost World, though Sonic and Eggman had formed an alliance for most of the game, it ends with him being the surprise final boss. I can only imagine that he doesn't care to include the events of Lost World because even though Sonic was the one that ruined his control over the Zeddy, it was clear that without Sonic, Eggman wouldn't be able to deal with them should they manage to break free of his control in a different way. At any other point in the timeline, at least he would still have control over his badniks. Against the Zeddy, not so much. But anyway, what does that have to do with the bosses I mentioned? Well, remember how I said that cyberspace conforms to the memory of the person entering it? The BioLizard is an example of a boss that is exclusive to Shadow and almost tore my whole theory apart. But then I thought about it. While Sonic never fought the BioLizard in the form that Shadow does, he does fight it alongside Shadow as the final hazard, and I think the reason Shadow fights this version of the boss has to do with how these portals operate. During Sonic's portion of this theory, I mentioned that the Chaos Emeralds are superdimensional objects that exist at all moments across time. The state in which they exist at any given point is how they exist at all other points. And as we know, Shadow is in possession of one of the Chaos Emeralds, while the rest are in Sonic's area of white space, and this is further exemplified by the fact that we don't see any Chaos Emeralds at the cannon's core, even though that's where they were during this point in time. What that leads me to understand is that if you don't have all the Chaos Emeralds and try to revisit a moment in history where they were strictly necessary, you can't revisit that moment in time, but will instead be met with the closest thing to it. And think about it, in the perfect Chaos fight, Sonic never needed to be Super Sonic. He just needed to be able to run fast enough to go over the water and reach Chaos's brain. Even in the original game, you don't automatically die if you lose your super form. You can't exactly do anything to win, but you don't lose straight away. In Generations, Sonic may not have the Chaos Emeralds, but as we talked about before, he now has the abilities needed to defeat him. But there would be absolutely no way for either Sonic or Shadow to fight the final hazard without their super forms. Not to mention, that fight required both Sonic and Shadow, so what happens when only one of them is here? Shadow can only face a version of this fight that didn't need the Chaos Emeralds and didn't need Sonic, a fight that exists in his memory, which would be the base BioLizard fight. As for why the BioLizard has a new mutation, I think the next two boss fights may explain this as well, so I'll talk about that in a bit. And we know that this is an important moment in time to restore because defeating the BioLizard as well as the final hazard is what allows Sonic and Shadow to stop the Ark's collision course. Eggman wouldn't have wanted this moment to be restored because in the event that Sonic were to fail, the Earth would have been destroyed. Metal Overlord is the boss that most made me consider that the entirety of white space was meant for Sonic. After all, Shadow never fights Metal Overlord, but its predecessor, Metal Madness. And despite the fact that these two can talk to each other, neither of them point out that this setup is strange. A lot of adjustments needed to be made for this fight to take place, but when you think about it, it's not unreasonable. I mentioned before that if there was a moment in time where all the Chaos Emeralds were necessary to revisit, you wouldn't be able to, and instead would face the closest thing to it, but I believe Metal Overlord is an example of the opposite. What happens when you can't revisit a fight that strictly requires others to fight it? In the Metal Madness fight, you need to attack his weak spot with a formation other than the one it's currently colored as. You can't attack it with Speed Formation if it's blue, Fly Formation if it's yellow, or Power Formation if it's red. Metal Overlord, meanwhile, doesn't have that weakness anymore since he's only damaged using Team Blast. So how can Shadow fight Metal Overlord when Team Blast requires, a team? And when losing all your rings, you immediately lose the fight. Well, here's where I think a lot of technicalities come into play. Really think about what happens when you use Team Blast against Metal Overlord. All Team Sonic does is repeatedly strike him. There's nothing too special about what happens. As well, while Eggman says that Metal is super strong with everyone's data, Overlord is just the complete version of Madness. Much like the BioLizard and the Final Hazard, they're technically not two separate beings, but the same being in a different context. The Final Hazard is just the BioLizard attached to the Eclipse cannon. In the same way, Metal Madness is just a Metal Overlord that can't fly yet. Similarly, and as we see in Shadow Generations, if Metal Overlord weren't flying, all we need to do is smack him really hard. Honestly, both of those reasons are why Sonic goes super in the first place. Metal Overlord flies away, and the only way Sonic can chase him is by going super, but the fight doesn't strictly need to happen this way. Similarly, I think we can all agree that Sonic would have been able to take on Metal Overlord on his own. He was fully ready to do this himself, but Tails and Knuckles insisted they would join him, and Sonic protects them by giving them super shields, not proper super forms. Now, I have my thoughts on why this is, which I'd like to go over in a separate video, but all we need to understand right now is that this fight is completely doable with Sonic alone. In fact, the name of the Team Blast is Supersonic Power, meaning that this is only possible because of Supersonic, not anything that Tails or Knuckles do. Regardless, Tails and Knuckles are superpowered but aren't in a super form, and yet they're still able to help damage Metal Overlord, meaning that a super form isn't strictly required to defeat him, and I believe this is why Shadow fights this version of Metal. He may be flying, but he can fly above the water while you surf. If Shadow had the Doom Wings at this point in the story, I don't doubt this fight would be a lot more similar to the Neo Devil Doom fight. He doesn't have a weak spot that requires a specific formation, and what's funny is that the only time Shadow attacks Overlord directly, he's hitting the green light where his weak spot once was. When you think about it, this is another example of just hitting Metal super hard, because he can still move while you use Chaos Control, but it isn't Chaos Control itself that makes him vulnerable to an attack from Shadow. It's Shadow's ability to use Chaos Dash that lets him travel really fast and hit Metal really hard, just like using the Dash Rings lets him do so. During his second phase, again, Chaos Control isn't used to be able to strike him, but to knock a substantially large amount of debris into him. In fact, the rest of the fight doesn't require us to hit that green light since we're using Doom Surf to flick debris into Metal, again, just smacking him really hard, meaning that the Chaos Emeralds were never strictly necessary for this fight, they just made it easier to damage him. Restoring this moment in time is obviously necessary because without Metal Overlord's defeat, the world would be completely transformed into a kingdom of robots. Eggman, meanwhile, hoped to keep this moment locked away so that Metal Sonic never had the chance to transform in the first place. Mephiles is the most interesting one because I think his inclusion in the game is one that has the most visually evident lore implications. For one, it's the only regular boss not found in white space itself, nor is it found in a castle. Instead, it's hidden in an underground area, someplace where you almost forget that you're in white space at all. And the boss gate is only accessible by having the only Doom power that fully transforms Shadow into something he isn't. The rest of the Doom powers act as an extension of Shadow. His Chaos Spears become more powerful, his attacks strike harder, he grows a manta ray that he can surf on, he grows wings he can use to fly, but Doom Morph is the only thing that allows Shadow to traverse through what we now know as corruption and fully changes his form into something else. As well, the boss gate down here is the only one across both Sonic and Shadow generations that requires 4 boss keys instead of 3, almost as if this is one that's meant to be super locked away. Now, the only version of Mephiles that Sonic ever encountered and fought was Solaris itself, and it would make sense for Solaris to be the one that is guarded extra carefully. Kingdom Valley, for all intents and purposes, still exists to this day. There's nothing wrong with it existing out in the open despite the events of 06 being erased. Solaris, however, as a being, was erased entirely, and revisiting its existence, I imagine, would create some kind of paradox. How do you consume a timeline that is already non-existent? What happens when you try to destroy white space? Fortunately, because Sonic's not here, we don't have to figure that out, and I think the reason Mephiles is whom you encounter here is twofold. Not only are the Chaos Emeralds, as well as Sonic and Silver's presence necessary for the Solaris fight to take place again, but given the existence of Crisis City in Sonic's white space, it's possible that Solaris can't currently exist anyway, because Iblis is the one responsible for Crisis City's being in the state that it is. So what happens when Shadow the Hedgehog tries to access Solaris' portal without the means to fight it, and when one half of it is already somewhere else? That would only leave Mephiles at the point in time in Shadow's story right before he joins with Iblis again. And the reason I can determine the exact moment Mephiles might be from is because originally Shadow came here with Rouge and Omega, but Mephiles was completely free. He came here to find the remaining Chaos Emerald and... Wait, which Chaos Emerald was he here to collect? No way, dude! The yellow one? The one Shadow has right now during the events of Generations? It's no wonder this is the fight we're revisiting in the same way that the fake yellow emerald probably adds to why Sonic and Shadow revisited their fight aboard the Ark. And actually, what Chaos Emerald does Metal Sonic have in Sonic Generations? The purple one. Literally the only time Metal Sonic can collect a purple Chaos Emerald is in Sonic Drift 2. Coincidentally, the very first game where you can even play as Metal Sonic, which also just so happens to be a classic era game. Sonic R doesn't have a purple emerald, and even so, if you unlock Super Sonic after collecting all the emeralds, that must mean that Eggman and his team never had any of them, right? You never go Super Sonic in Sonic Drift 2. And the emerald you collect from Silver is the white one of the 2 he had at the end of his campaign in Sonic 06. Funnily enough, the other one he had, the cyan one, is one you collect in this era as well, after defeating the Egg Dragoon. There's no way they thought about this as much as we have, right? But okay, back to Mephiles. In 06, after defeating him in his second phase, Shadow tries to reseal him in the Scepter of Darkness he and Rouge crafted in Soliana, which Mephiles immediately breaks out of. And And how does the fight in Generations start? With Mephiles escaping the Scepter of Darkness once Shadow approaches it, followed by Mephiles using the same attack that he used to kill Sonic, one that he never used against Shadow in 06. And there's yet another great reason as to why this is the fight Shadow re-experiences as opposed to their first encounter at Flame Core. There, Shadow needed Omega's help to defeat him, while here, despite having Rouge and Omega at his side, they really didn't do much besides have his back. And of course, there's the line of dialogue that ties so much of this entire theory together. At the beginning of the fight, Mephiles says, "I will defeat you, then restore myself to the timeline," meaning he knows he has existed somewhere outside of the timeline since he was erased. But I don't think that this knowledge necessarily applies to everyone. We know that modern Eggman knows this in the Egg Dragoon fight, though it's unclear if classic Eggman knows this in the Death Egg Robot one. I just suspect that he doesn't. Mephiles clearly knows, but Metal Overlord seems to have just transformed in his fight, evidenced by him saying that he is now the true Sonic, alongside not mentioning anything about taking on this form again. The outliers are Perfect Chaos and the BioLizard, since they can't communicate, meaning we don't know what's going through their mind right now. But I think we can venture a guess with the context clues we already have. Perfect Chaos and Metal Overlord must be from moments in time where they had just transformed, so their knowledge and abilities mirror those they had during those original encounters. Mephiles has a few new techniques, ones that he didn't have in the original fight, which makes sense if he's a Mephiles that was not only meant to be Solaris, but who knows he's removed from the timeline. Similarly, if the BioLizard was meant to be the final hazard, but is from a moment in time when it was first released from the canon's core, it stands to reason that it remembers this fight, which is why it almost immediately tries to do something new when what it used to do before fails the first time. As well, I think Mephiles' line confirms that these are moments in the timeline that we're revisiting. If this was a moment that was only just happening now, Mephiles would still be erased from time. But if he defeats Shadow in the past, even a past removed from existence, Shadow never helped collect the Chaos Emerald used to revive Sonic, nor does he manage to help defeat Solaris in the past, meaning Solaris never gets blown out, meaning he gets reinstated in the timeline. And I think it goes without saying why this is both a pivotal moment in time that needs to be restored, as well as why Eggman wouldn't have wanted it to be revisited. Now, Radical Highway is a location that exists outside of Whitespace, which makes sense because Sonic never canonically ventured through that level. It's a location that Shadow continuously experiences throughout his adventure by way of what's known as the Doom Zone, a dimension created by Black Doom to test Shadow's Doom powers. What I find so curious about the Doom Zone, and this was something else that made me question what the rules behind Whitespace might have been, is that despite Shadow gaining his Doom powers throughout the game, the Doom Zone only made appearances during certain levels: Space Colony Arc, Rail Canyon, and Sunset Heights. The thing those three share in common is that out of the 5 levels we find in Shadow's Whitespace, those are the 3 that Shadow has been to in the current timeline. No memory of Kingdom Valley, and outside of his visit in this game, he's never been to Chaos Island. On top of that, I believe that there's a thematic significance to the places he gets the Doom Gears, the objects that allow Shadow to unlock his Doom powers. Before Sonic X Shadow Generations had released, I was working on a video where I talked about what the link between Shadow and the bosses we knew he would face in this game were. Back then, it was more wishful thinking, maybe even seeing something where there maybe was nothing, but now I'm not so sure. Now I think I was kinda spot on. The reason the Doom Zone highly reflects Shadow's very first stage isn't because Black Doom just really likes Radical Highway, but because of what that level means for Shadow as a character, which was something else I talked about in that video. Radical Highway in Adventure 2 was the first level we ever played through as Shadow, and this was when we learned what Shadow was motivated by. At this point in Shadow's life, he wants nothing more than to exact revenge on humanity for what happened to Maria. And though I doubt Black Doom has any connection to this place personally, we know that he can conjure and maybe even understand parts of Shadow's memory that he can then use against him. In Shadow the Hedgehog, Black Doom makes Shadow relive his past in the level The Doom, at a time where we can surmise that Black Doom wasn't present, but still knows what happened aboard the Ark. He does this to remind Shadow of why he resents humans so much, in order to use Shadow as a warrior fighting for the Black Arms. Here, it's no different. The Doom Zone resembles Radical Highway so much because it's a place that should remind Shadow of his desire for revenge against humanity. So what does all this have to do with the Doom Gears? Well, think about when we get them. Despite there being 5 Doom powers and 5 Whitespace stages, we don't get a Doom Gear after every stage. We only get them in places where Shadow would feel the most vulnerable. We get the first one after completing Space Colony Arc, a place that holds a lot of painful memories for Shadow. This is where he was created and is where he lost the people he most loved. We get the second one at Rail Canyon, where he first learns of the existence of the Shadow androids. The third one is obtained after defeating the BioLizard, a reminder of Project Shadow, the nature of Shadow's existence, and what it was he was meant to live up to. The fourth one we get after defeating Metal Overlord, a robot that has copied his data. If a machine can do that, is Shadow possibly one of the androids he encountered before? And finally, Mephiles, someone that seems to know Shadow very well and bears a striking resemblance to him. Though Shadow doesn't remember him, Mephiles too tried to get Shadow to resent humanity and cause their destruction, even trying to sow doubt in his friends. Shadow may not remember, but time left an imprint on his subconscious memory. Radical Highway is the only level that takes place inside the Doom Zone, meaning that it isn't part of white space in any way, and we know this because the first time it happens is in Space Colony Arc Act 1, before the Time Meter does anything. This is one of the main reasons why I think white space was meant exclusively for Sonic. Why would Radical Highway, a place that even Black Doom knows holds vital importance to Shadow's history, not be a part of his white space? I think it's also worth mentioning that Radical Highway's second act is the only one in the game that isn't in 2D, but fully in 3D, adding to my theory that the Act 1s in white space are Sonic's memory, while the Act 2s are taken from Shadow's version of events, if not entirely reconstructed. Act 1 is mostly taken from the original Radical Highway, while Act 2 has hints of Westopolis, but is mostly new, even introducing a Black Arms we've never seen before. And remember, even these fully realized versions of Radical Highway are still wrong. The buildings are upside down, sideways, the roads somehow make less sense than the original, there are things that shouldn't be there, billboards that make reference to the fact that you're in a dimension different to where you were before. You can't use chaos control here, your signature ability is stripped from you. They do everything they can to make it perfectly clear that this is not the Radical Highway we know. This is the Doom Zone, and it affects the entirety of Shadow's white space. Boss gates now have a hard mode, new challenge gates appear that take one of the existing challenges and make them more difficult, and even the time switches around white space are more challenging to complete. In fact, those time switches don't show up until you defeat the BioLizard, and neither do Gerald's journals, held inside balloons that are carried by the flying targets you find in Rail Canyon, meaning the pages of Gerald's journal are somehow being protected by Eggman. Which makes sense when you consider that Gunn retrieved the remains of the journal after the events of Adventure 2, as stated in the note left by Professor Victoria to the commander. Quote, "This journal was recovered during the investigation of Dr. Eggman's stronghold following the latest incident with the Ark. The same diary that Eggman hands to Rouge in Adventure 2, and what a coincidence that they don't start to appear in white space until after the boss fight where we encountered the time switches and read the diary, protected by things Eggman used in the very next entry in the series. And yet, none of this ever affected Sonic. Sonic never saw the Doom Zone. As far as he knew, none of what Shadow experienced ever happened. You can't access Sonic's white space from Shadow's area. The one time the two cross paths is after completing Chaos Island, the place where Sonic was thinking about Shadow, but after their fight over the Emerald, Shadow reappears in his own white space, a place Sonic was never meant to find. And what was another incident that Eggman likely wishes would never happen? Though far from teaming up with you, Dr. Eggman surely didn't want the Black Arms invading again, so it's no wonder that Black Doom and his minions only appear in the area of white space that Sonic isn't meant to visit. And there are no levels there that Sonic would be able to visit, since Sonic had little influence over that point in the timeline. Devil Doom all but confirms what our suspicions have been thus far. His fight isn't revisiting the one from Shadow the Hedgehog. This is a fight happening now. The Chaos Emeralds aren't necessary this time around. Just Shadow and his Doom powers. And nothing makes this clearer than his transformation into Neo Devil Doom, a brand new phase we've never faced before. And once Devil Doom is defeated, his influence in white space disappears almost immediately. The Black Moon is gone, Shadow's Doom powers are gone, and the Radical Highway platforms fade away too. But everything else in white space remains, except of course for Gerald and Maria, who begin to fade away as well. But why? Why would defeating Black Doom, who didn't know he'd end up in white space in the first place, be the reason Gerald and Maria are here too? As far as we know, none of the other characters return to their own time once Black Doom is defeated, so why do the Robotniks? Well, the only thing I can think is that them being here is an accident as well. If Black Doom's intent was to cause Shadow pain in order to be able to take control of his body, part of that pain may have manifested in the form of Gerald and Maria. But rather than being illusions brought forth by Black Doom, or characters brought here by Eggman, I think that Gerald and Maria being in white space is for a similar reason that the time switches, as well as Gerald's journal, appear. They're linked to events that Shadow restores.
Shadow only notices Maria after restoring Space Colony Ark, and it seems as if both she and the professor had only just arrived now. As well, and I'm only just realizing this, neither Gerald nor Maria ever mentioned seeing the Time Eater, meaning they simply showed up here from some point in the past, after Shadow's creation, but before the raid on the Ark. And if Shadow eliminates that which is trying to cause him pain, the source of his pain must disappear as well. Isn't it strange that some of these characters appear where they do while having no connection to these places? The same can be said about Sonic Generations, since some characters don't seem to have much of a connection to the place they're found near, but you could make the argument that they're trying to fill in the blanks. Tails wasn't in Sonic 1, but there's no one else who would be so closely related to Sonic's first adventure, so they put him there and Amy in the Sonic 2 location in lieu of a Sonic CD one. Knuckles makes sense in Sky Sanctuary, Cream can be found in Station Square in the director's cut version of Sonic Adventure, which was released a year after Cream's debut in Advance 2. Rouge makes perfect sense in City Escape, Espio makes sense in Seaside Hill, and Blaze makes sense in Crisis City, though maybe a bit less sense in-universe. Vector is a big strong guy with sharp teeth, similar to the Werehog, so I guess that's why he's at Rooftop Run, and Charmy's a small flying dude, much like the Wisps, so maybe that's why he's at their planet. But in Shadow Generations even more so. Omega, as far as we know, has never even been close to the Ark. Orbot and Cubot made their debut well after Heroes, but fit the color scheme of the flying and power formations. If you think of Metal Sonic, another of Eggman's robots has the speed formation. Big, we didn't even know had been to Soliana until this game, and here's the thing, Sunset Heights and Chaos Island are locations from Sonic's future. If Sonic hadn't already rescued Rouge, nobody would be at Chaos Island, which makes Gerald and Maria's position at Sunset Heights make a bit more sense. They were never supposed to be here, but there may yet be another explanation. In the cutscene just before fighting the Time Eater, classic Eggman clearly has no idea who Rouge and Shadow are, meaning his future self never disclosed information about Sonic's allies or the enemies he makes in the future. And it's not just that he doesn't know who they are, clearly he wouldn't because he has no reason to, but it's as if he's confused that anyone else is here at all. That means that either modern Eggman didn't disclose the full plan to his past self, or that the Time Eater acted in a somewhat independent way, which makes sense when you consider that it specifically went to the Ark to place it somewhere in white space, not necessarily to take Shadow himself. Everyone at Sonic's birthday seems scared and are trapped in limbo. So why aren't the people in Shadow's white space? Omega says that he was hunting down the Time Eater when it unleashed a temporal anomaly, which explains why Omega seemed like he had just been knocked down when we first showed up. Black Doom just so happened to re-emerge at the same time on the Ark, which is why when we first appear, the Black Moon is entirely inactive. When we talk to Orbot and Cubot, they admit that Eggman had just followed the Time Eater and disappeared, meaning they're likely from the ending of Colors. We don't really know how much time has passed between the events of that game and this one, so it's entirely possible that they're saying that because that's the last relevant thing they remember. Big, as always, was just chasing after Froggy, and much like Gerald and Maria, he also never mentions the Time Eater, saying that he was just going about his day and somehow wound up here, entirely unrelated to anything. And again, I think his presence here explains a lot of how white space works. If you notice, much like Sonic Generations, you can't interact with the characters until you complete both acts of a stage, but that isn't true for Omega. He's fine as soon as we get here, meaning that these characters aren't necessarily tied to the locations we find them at, which makes a lot of sense. If Sonic had access to this part of white space, I don't doubt he would have found them in different locations. Big at Space Colony Ark due to his cameo appearances throughout the levels in Adventure 2, Omega at Rail Canyon as his debut game, and Orbot and Cubot at Sunset Heights, where Sonic sees them right before being sent to null space and again after returning from it. White space, null space, cyberspace, all places Sonic escapes with his speed. I'm not gonna get into that again. The reason I think he would find them here, despite them not doing much in Forces, is because he at least knows who they are at this point, and if they know Shadow, he probably knows them too. Since Shadow clearly has no memories of the events of 06, it's likely why Elise is nowhere to be found. And did you notice that we all end up here in pairs? Shadow and Omega, Orbot and Cubot, Big and Froggy, I assume he's here somewhere, and Gerald and Maria. But there are two key characters from locations that are here that don't appear anywhere: Infinite and Sage. My only guess is because they don't exist in anyone's memory yet, while these locations do. Crisis City may not exist in its current state, but it's a place that does exist in some form, and though we never see Iblis directly, we know he must exist here because of his minions. We see Sunset Heights taken over by Eggman as a result of Infinite defeating Sonic, but we never see Infinite himself, nor any of the phantom copies or illusions he creates. And I believe the reason to be because the Eggman and Sonic that are currently occupying white space have no memory of them. Classic Sonic may not have any memory of the more contemporary locations and characters he's met with, but his modern self does. Something else to note is that Shadow restoring these moments in time has nothing to do with him facing Black Doom. Shadow could be anywhere, experiencing anything, and Black Doom would still test his new abilities. The levels Shadow goes through just so happen to be the backdrop where this happens. To wrap things up, I'm also going to talk about the DLC level Tokyo, which is an interesting little addition to Generations, and though we know that it's essentially non-canon, it's just a fun little side thing, I still don't think it contradicts anything we've talked about so far. The game calls the rift that contains the ring gate an anomaly, meaning that this is yet another thing that's not supposed to be here. Once we approach it is when the ring gate appears, something you can do as early as when you first arrive in white space, and we know that the characters we meet in Shadow's adventure don't just appear after we complete the respective stages we find them near. They're here as soon as we are too, and if Gerald and Maria are only here because of Black Doom's influence, it could very well be that this space-time rift is here for similar reasons. Once we enter, we're sent to what the game calls the world of movies, set during the events of the third live-action Sonic film, specifically the part where Shadow arrives in mainland Tokyo right after escaping from Prison Island following his 50-year encapsulation. What's interesting about this is that this is yet another location that Shadow shares with Sonic, since this is where their first encounter and chase sequence occurs. But I think it's no coincidence that this is set in a place and time where Gun would be persecuting Shadow, something his game counterpart knows he wouldn't normally have to worry about. It's also a place and time where movie Shadow's resentment is at an all-time high, the wound is still very fresh. And when you consider all this, in a way, Tokyo is the movie's version of Radical Highway, so it makes total sense that, much like it in this game, Tokyo is the only other level to feature a musical track based off of a Shadow level and not a Sonic one, remixing the theme from Westopolis, the very first stage from his own game. As well, the way the stages entered and left also don't align with the other stages. We enter from a ring gate, never come across a goal ring or any other traditional end goal, and leave through another ring gate that happens to appear. Actually, the ring gate we enter places us at the location where and time when Sonic and Shadow first meet in the movie. Remember, Shadow had arrived at Shibuya Crossing well before this, and we see him discover just how long he'd been trapped, followed by Gun's arrival to recapture him, but the game places us at a point in time when Shadow had already taken them all out. As well, the ring gate we exit from shows up at the location where Sonic and Shadow's fight ends, at the Tokyo Tower. Even across dimensions, this anomaly can't help separate Shadow from Sonic because white space is catered to Sonic. Westopolis may be a level from Shadow's own game, but at the forefront of Black Doom's invasion is Sonic, who doesn't know what's going on. As far as he knows, this is the start of a new adventure for him as well. When you think about it, Westopolis is as much Sonic's first level from this game as it is Shadow's, so it's no wonder that a location in space-time where another version of Sonic is chasing a literal black alien through a dark city full of gun soldiers would somehow make its way into white space as well. You know, I started this video with a neat little idea, one that I could almost feel myself forcing to make sense at times, like trying to fit different sized coins into a single sized slot. Some ideas would fit perfectly, some would fit if you pushed them hard enough, and some of them just fell on in. But the more I thought about things, and the more I reflected and revisited what happened in some of these games, the more I found things I hadn't originally considered that supported my theories. And again, I don't think that this was the original plan for White Space at all. I fully believe that it's just the backdrop to compile some of the most iconic characters and locations from the series' history, full stop. But it's definitely fulfilling to me to know that, in a way, this does make sense, and they could absolutely roll with this explanation if they really wanted to. I'm excited to see what comes next in the series, because as chaotic as the storytelling in the 2000s were, it now seems like they're trying their best to control that chaos in equally crazy ways. There was a point in time where we sort of mocked Sonic fighting against water gods and genetic experiments and data-stealing robots and Shadow having alien DNA and time-traveling hedgehogs, but now that they're trying to make sense of it all, it's almost like we're mocking them for trying to consolidate this story. Like, I get it, not everything needs to make sense all the time in games where you play as a cartoon character that defies the laws of physics, but I don't know, I guess I also don't see what's wrong with that. Writing this whole thing was super fun for me because have you guys ever seen those art pieces made up of puzzles that aren't supposed to fit together, but then the artist arranges them in a way that creates something that was never intended, but still manages to make it all fit? It's kind of like that. White Space was always interesting to me. There was always something to it that I felt had an explanation beyond what we were given story-wise. And hopefully, you see it the way I do now, too. Thank you all so much for watching, and please let me know your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear it. On screen, you're seeing the names of the wonderful patrons and channel members that support this channel each month. You are by no means obligated to join them, but if you would like to do so, you can find links down in the description. Any little bit helps. But if you can't, or if you don't want to, liking, commenting, sharing it with anyone you think might find it interesting, all of that helps a ton. So please make sure to do that. Any little bit helps. And until next time, stay safe and stay awesome, everyone.